The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's capital city. Children ran barefoot between mud brick houses, their laughter echoing through narrow alleyways where families struggled to make ends meet. This landlocked West African nation, once known as Upper Volta, had always been among the world's poorest countries. Most of its 22 million people survived on less than $2 a day, farming millet and sorghum on land that seemed to reject prosperity at every turn. Dr. Sarah Konate, a geology professor at the University of Ouagadougou, had grown tired of watching her country suffer while neighboring nations discovered mineral wealth. Born and raised in a small village outside the capital, she remembered her grandmother telling stories of ancestors who believed the earth held secrets that would one day transform their homeland. As a child, Sarah would collect unusual rocks and study them by candlelight, dreaming of finding something extraordinary beneath Burkina Faso's red soil. After completing her doctorate in petroleum geology at the Sorbonne in Paris, Sarah returned home with a burning desire to prove that her country held untapped potential. She spent years writing grant proposals, begging international organizations for funding, and facing rejection after rejection. Most investors saw Burkina Faso as a lost cause, a country too poor and unstable to justify expensive geological surveys. The breakthrough came in 2023 when Sarah met Dr. James Morrison, a retired British petroleum engineer who had spent decades exploring oil fields across Africa. Morrison had grown wealthy from discoveries in Nigeria and Angola, but success had left him searching for something more meaningful than profit. During a conference in Accra, Ghana, Sarah cornered him after his presentation and spoke passionately about seismic readings she had detected in northeastern Burkina Faso. Morrison was initially skeptical. Burkina Faso had been explored by major oil companies in the 1980s and 1990s with disappointing results. The country's geological formation didn't match the typical profiles of oil-rich regions. However, something in Sarah's data intrigued him. She had identified unusual magnetic anomalies and gravitational variations in the Sahel region that previous surveys had overlooked. Against his business partner's advice, Morrison agreed to fund a preliminary exploration mission. He assembled a small team of experienced geologists and invested $2 million of his own money into advanced seismic equipment. Sarah would lead the local operations while Morrison provided technical expertise and international connections. The team arrived in the remote village of Kanchari in March 2024, bringing with them truck-mounted drilling equipment and computers that looked like alien technology to local residents. Village elder Amadou Ouedraogo welcomed the strangers, but warned them that many previous visitors had made grand promises before disappearing forever. His weathered hands gestured toward abandoned wells from failed mining operations that dotted the landscape like scars. Sarah understood the villagers' skepticism. Foreign companies had extracted gold and cotton from Burkina Faso for decades while leaving communities poorer than before. She made a promise that would later prove prophetic. If they found anything valuable, the local people would benefit directly from the discovery. The first weeks of exploration yielded frustrating results. Core samples showed typical sedimentary rock formations with no obvious signs of hydrocarbon deposits. Morrison began questioning his investment, especially when his drilling equipment broke down repeatedly in the harsh desert conditions. Team morale plummeted as temperatures soared above 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and sandstorms buried their equipment in fine red dust. Local children gathered daily to watch the strange foreigners work. They brought the team water and helped translate between Arabic, French, and local Moray dialects when communication broke down. Sarah formed a particularly strong bond with 12-year-old Fatimata, whose father had died in a mining accident years earlier. The girl reminded Sarah of her younger self, curious, intelligent, and desperate for opportunities that seemed impossible in rural Burkina Faso. On April 15th, everything changed. The team was preparing to abandon their current drilling site and move to a different location when their seismic readings detected something unusual 3,000 feet below ground. Morrison had seen similar patterns before in successful oil fields, but the data seemed too good to be true. According to their instruments, they were sitting above a massive underground formation that could contain significant petroleum deposits. Sarah barely slept that night, checking and rechecking their calculations. If their readings were accurate, they might have stumbled upon one of the largest oil reserves ever discovered in West Africa. But she had learned not to get excited too early. Previous false alarms had broken her heart and depleted their funding. The next morning brought a mixture of anticipation and anxiety as Morrison ordered deeper core sampling. The drilling equipment groaned and strained as it penetrated layers of rock that had remained undisturbed for millions of years. Local villagers gathered in larger numbers, sensing that something important was happening even though they couldn't understand the technical discussions. At 2:47 p.m. local time, the drill bit broke through into a pressurized chamber 3,147 feet below ground. What happened next would be remembered as the moment everything changed for Burkina Faso. A dark, viscous liquid began seeping up through the drilling apparatus, coating the equipment in crude oil that gleamed like black gold under the African sun. Morrison's hands trembled as he collected samples in glass containers. His portable testing equipment confirmed what his experience had already told him. This was high-quality crude oil with excellent commercial potential. But the real shock came when they analyzed the geological survey data that evening. Their preliminary calculations suggested they had discovered not just an oil deposit, but potentially one of the world's largest untapped petroleum reserves. The Yad underground formation appeared to extend across hundreds of square kilometers, possibly containing billions of barrels of recoverable oil. If confirmed, this discovery would transform Burkina Faso from one of the world's poorest nations into a major oil-producing country overnight. Sarah called her mother that evening, her voice barely containing her excitement. For the first time in her life, she dared to imagine a future where Burkina Faso's children wouldn't need to migrate to neighboring countries in search of work, where hospitals would have reliable electricity and schools would have books and computers, where her grandmother's stories about the Earth's hidden treasures would finally come true. But as she looked out at the vast expanse of desert surrounding their camp, Sarah knew that confirming their discovery was only the beginning. The real challenges, political, economic, and social, were yet to come. News of the potential oil discovery spread through Kanchari village like wildfire, carried by whispers and excited conversations in local dialects. Within days, word reached regional administrators, then provincial governors, and finally the corridors of power in Ouagadougou. President Ibrahim Traoré, who had come to power through a military coup in 2022, received the preliminary report during a cabinet meeting focused on the country's mounting economic crisis. Traoré read the geological survey with growing amazement. If the estimates were accurate, Burkina Faso was sitting on approximately 50 billion barrels of recoverable crude oil, enough to rival Saudi Arabia's proven reserves and potentially generate trillions of dollars in revenue over the coming decades. For a country whose entire annual budget barely exceeded $3 billion, such numbers seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Dr. Morrison flew to the capital immediately to meet with government officials, bringing with him detailed seismic data and core sample analysis. The presidential palace, a modest building by international standards, buzzed with unprecedented excitement as ministers struggled to process the magnitude of what they were hearing. Finance Minister Rosine Coulibaly, an economist trained at Oxford University, performed rapid calculations that made her hands shake with anticipation. However, Morrison insisted on complete secrecy until additional confirmation tests could be completed. He had witnessed how premature announcements of oil discoveries had destabilized other African nations, attracting unwanted international attention and internal power struggles before proper extraction infrastructure was established. President Traoré agreed to maintain absolute confidentiality while authorizing expanded exploration operations. Meanwhile, in Kanchari village, life had already begun changing in subtle but significant ways. Sarah's exploration team hired dozens of local workers to support their expanded drilling operations, bringing steady wages to families who had never experienced regular income. Village elder Amadou Ouedraogo watched with cautious optimism as young men who had been preparing to migrate to Côte d'Ivoire or Ghana suddenly found meaningful work in their homeland. Fatimata, the 12-year-old girl who had befriended Sarah, began asking increasingly sophisticated questions about geology and engineering. Sarah spent evening hours teaching her basic scientific concepts, using rocks and sand to demonstrate geological formation processes. The girl's natural curiosity and quick learning reminded Sarah why this discovery mattered beyond mere economic statistics. It represented hope for an entire generation of African children. The expanded drilling program required more sophisticated equipment and additional expertise. Morrison contacted his network of retired petroleum engineers, gradually assembling a team of specialists who could work discreetly while conducting comprehensive reservoir analysis. Each new core sample and seismic survey confirmed their initial findings. Burkina Faso was sitting on one of the largest undiscovered oil fields in the world. Dr. Elena Petrov, a Russian reservoir engineer with 30 years of experience in Siberian oil fields, joined the team in June 2024. Her expertise in analyzing complex geological formations proved crucial in mapping the full extent of the underground petroleum deposits. Working 16-hour days in temperatures that regularly exceeded 115 degrees Fahrenheit, Petrov's team identified at least 7 distinct oil-bearing rock formations extending across an area larger than Belgium. The discovery's scope became clearer with each passing week. Advanced 3D seismic mapping revealed that the oil deposits were not limited to the Kanchari region, but extended deep into neighboring provinces. The petroleum reservoir appeared to be part of an ancient geological structure that had been forming for over 100 million years, trapping organic materials that had slowly transformed into crude oil under immense pressure and heat. President Traoré faced an increasingly difficult challenge: how to prepare his country for the transformative changes that oil wealth would bring while maintaining the secrecy necessary to prevent destabilization. He quietly began consulting with leaders from other oil-producing African nations, seeking advice on avoiding the resource curse that had plagued countries like Nigeria and Equatorial Guinea. The president's most trusted advisor, General Célestin Simpore, had studied petroleum economics during military training in France. He warned Traoré about the dangers of rapid wealth accumulation in countries lacking strong institutional frameworks. Historical examples showed that sudden oil discoveries often led to corruption, civil conflict, and economic inequality rather than broad-based prosperity. Sarah found herself caught between scientific excitement and growing anxiety about her country's future. She had witnessed how resource extraction had affected other African nations, creating wealthy elites while leaving rural populations marginally better off than before. During long nights in the desert camp, she developed detailed proposals for ensuring that oil revenues would fund education, healthcare, and infrastructure development rather than disappearing into offshore bank accounts. The international petroleum industry began taking notice despite official secrecy efforts. Satellite imagery showed increased activity in northeastern Burkina Faso, and intelligence networks that monitored global energy markets detected unusual equipment purchases and personnel movements. Representatives from major oil companies, Shell, ExxonMobil, Total, and Chinese National Petroleum Corporation, began making discreet inquiries about potential investment opportunities. Morrison received increasingly aggressive approaches from multinational corporations offering to buy out his exploration rights for hundreds of millions of dollars. Each offer was accompanied by veiled threats about the challenges of operating in a politically unstable region without proper corporate backing. He declined all offers, determined to ensure that Burkina Faso retained majority control over its newly discovered resources. The psychological impact on local communities was profound and complex. Families who had struggled with poverty for generations suddenly heard rumors about potential wealth beyond their imagination. Some embraced the possibility with excitement and hope, while others worried about losing their traditional way of life. Village meetings became heated discussions about change, opportunity, and the unpredictable nature of fortune. Traditional religious leaders struggled to interpret the discovery within their spiritual frameworks. Imam Abdullah Sawadogo, who led prayers at Kanchari's small mosque, spent hours discussing with village elders whether the oil represented divine blessing or a test of their community's values. Christian pastors in nearby villages preached sermons about stewardship, and the responsibility that comes with unexpected wealth. Sarah's mother, Aminata Konate, traveled from Ouagadougou to visit the drilling site in August 2024. A retired schoolteacher, who had spent decades educating children in one of the world's poorest countries, she stood quietly beside the oil derricks that had transformed the landscape. Her daughter's achievement represented not just personal success, but vindication of her lifelong belief that education and persistence could overcome any obstacle. As summer turned to autumn, the confirmation tests reached their final stages. Multiple independent laboratories had analyzed core samples and confirmed the presence of high-quality crude oil in commercially viable quantities. The reservoir pressure tests indicated that extraction would be relatively straightforward, without the complex deep-water drilling required in offshore fields. Morrison's final report, delivered to President Traoré in September 2024, confirmed what everyone had hoped but barely dared believe. Burkina Faso possessed proven oil reserves of approximately 50 billion barrels, with potential reserves that could exceed 75 billion barrels. At current global prices, the discovery represented potential revenues of over $4 trillion, more than 1,000 times the country's annual GDP. The weight of this information kept President Traoré awake at night. Within months, his country would transform from international aid recipient to major global energy producer. The responsibility was overwhelming, but the opportunity was unprecedented in African history. October 2024 marked the beginning of the most challenging phase of Burkina Faso's oil discovery journey. President Traoré knew that announcing the discovery would trigger immediate international attention, potentially destabilizing his young government before proper institutions could be established to manage the country's new wealth. Working with his closest advisors, he developed a careful strategy for revealing the discovery while maintaining national control over the resources. The first step involved strengthening legal frameworks. Burkina Faso's existing mining laws were inadequate for managing petroleum resources of such magnitude. A team of constitutional lawyers, led by Professor Marie-Claire Ouedraogo from the University of Ouagadougou's law faculty, worked secretly to draft comprehensive legislation governing oil extraction, revenue distribution, and foreign investment terms. Sarah continued her work in Kanchari, but her role evolved from exploration scientist to community liaison. She organized town halls where villagers could ask questions about the coming changes and express their concerns about potential impacts on their traditional lifestyle. These meetings revealed deep divisions within the community about how to balance economic opportunity with cultural preservation. Fatimata, now 13 years old, had become Sarah's unofficial assistant, helping translate technical concepts into local languages and serving as a bridge between the scientific team and village youth. Her transformation from curious child to confident young woman embodied the potential that oil wealth could unlock for Burkina Faso's next generation. The secret couldn't be contained indefinitely. In November 2024, a French intelligence report, based on satellite imagery and communications intercepts, suggested that Burkina Faso might have discovered significant oil reserves. The report circulated among European Union member states and eventually reached energy companies that had previously shown no interest in the country. President Traoré decided to take control of the narrative before rumors could destabilize the situation. On December 1, 2024, he called a press conference at the presidential palace, inviting international media representatives who covered West African affairs. The announcement he was about to make would shock the world and forever change his country's destiny. Standing before a modest assembly of journalists, President Traoré spoke in clear, measured tones that masked the magnitude of his words. Distinguished members of the press, I am here to announce that the Republic of Burkina Faso has confirmed the discovery of substantial petroleum reserves in our northeastern region. Preliminary estimates suggest our country possesses approximately 50 billion barrels of recoverable crude oil. The room fell silent for several seconds before erupting in questions and camera flashes. International news agencies immediately recognized the significance. If confirmed, this discovery would rank among the largest oil finds in human history, potentially transforming not just Burkina Faso, but the entire West African region's Economic landscape. Within hours, the story dominated headlines worldwide. Burkina Faso discovers 50 billion barrels of oil appeared on front pages from London to Tokyo. Financial markets reacted immediately, with energy commodity prices fluctuating as traders processed the implications of such a massive supply increase, entering global markets. The response from international petroleum companies was swift and overwhelming. Within 48 hours of the announcement, representatives from every major oil corporation had contacted the Burkina Faso government, requesting meetings to discuss partnership agreements. Private jets began arriving at Ouagadougou's international airport, carrying executives who offered billions of dollars for extraction rights. However, President Traoré had anticipated this response and implemented strict protocols for managing international interest. All meetings with foreign companies would be conducted through a newly established National Petroleum Authority, headed by Dr. Issouf Ouedraogo, a petroleum economist with experience at the African Development Bank. Sarah found herself thrust into an unexpected role as a national celebrity and symbol of African scientific achievement. International media sought her out for interviews, portraying her as the brilliant geologist who had discovered one of the world's largest oil reserves through persistence and local knowledge. She used these platforms to advocate for responsible, resource development that would benefit ordinary Burkina Faso citizens, rather than just government elites and foreign corporations. The discovery's announcement triggered complex reactions across West Africa. Neighboring countries like Mali and Niger, which had struggled with their own resource extraction challenges, watched nervously as their previously poor neighbor potentially became the region's wealthiest nation. Ghana and Nigeria, established oil producers worried about competition for international investment and export markets. France, the former colonial power, moved quickly to secure its interests. President Emmanuel Macron called Traoré personally to congratulate him on the discovery and offer French technical assistance in developing the oil fields. However, this offer came with implicit expectations about preferential access for French petroleum companies, expectations that Traoré politely but firmly declined to guarantee. China emerged as an aggressive competitor for influence in Burkina Faso's oil sector. Chinese state-owned enterprises offered comprehensive infrastructure development packages that included building roads, railways, refineries, and export terminals in exchange for long-term oil supply agreements. These proposals were attractive but raised concerns about debt sustainability and sovereign control. The United States, through its African Development Finance Corporation, presented an alternative model emphasizing technology transfer, environmental protection, and governance support. American officials highlighted successful partnerships with countries like Guyana, where recent oil discoveries had been developed through transparent, community-focused approaches. Within Burkina Faso, the oil discovery created unprecedented excitement mixed with anxiety about rapid change. University students organized celebrations in Ouagadougou, dreaming of job opportunities and modern infrastructure that oil revenues could finance. However, rural communities worried about displacement, environmental impact, and the potential loss of agricultural land that sustained their families. Religious leaders played crucial roles in helping communities process the dramatic changes ahead. Cardinal Philippe Ouedraogo, Archbishop of Ouagadougou, delivered sermons emphasizing stewardship and social responsibility, urging the government and citizens to use oil wealth for education, healthcare, and poverty reduction rather than personal enrichment. Traditional chiefs in the oil-bearing regions found themselves navigating complex negotiations about land rights and community compensation. The Mossi kingdoms, which had governed these territories for centuries through customary law, needed to establish formal agreements with the national government about resource extraction on ancestral lands. Environmental concerns emerged as another critical challenge. International conservation groups warned about potential impacts on the Sahel ecosystem, which was already stressed by climate change and desertification. Sarah worked with environmental scientists to develop monitoring protocols that would track air quality, water resources, and wildlife populations throughout the oil extraction process. The discovery also raised questions about regional security. Burkina Faso had been battling Islamist insurgencies in its northern regions, where some of the oil deposits were located. Military commanders worried that terrorist groups might target oil infrastructure or attempt to control petroleum revenues to fund their operations. President Traoré addressed these security concerns by announcing plans to significantly expand the military and establish specialized units trained in protecting critical infrastructure. However, he emphasized that security improvements would be coupled with development programs aimed at addressing the poverty and unemployment that made young people vulnerable to extremist recruitment. International development organizations scrambled to understand how massive oil wealth would affect their long-term programs in Burkina Faso. The World Bank, which had been funding poverty reduction initiatives, began discussions about transitioning from aid recipient to development partner as the country's economic status transformed. As 2024 ended, Burkina Faso stood at the threshold of unprecedented change. The oil discovery had created possibilities that seemed impossible just months earlier, but it had also introduced challenges that would test the nation's institutions, leadership, and social cohesion in ways no one could fully predict. June 2025 marked the first anniversary of the oil discovery's public announcement, and Burkina Faso had transformed beyond recognition. The capital city of Ouagadougou now featured gleaming skyscrapers funded by petroleum revenues, while rural villages that had lacked basic infrastructure for decades enjoyed modern amenities that seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. Sarah stood before the newly constructed National Science Complex, a world-class research facility that rivaled institutions in developed nations. As she addressed an international conference on sustainable resource development, her words carried the authority of someone who had witnessed firsthand how scientific discovery could reshape an entire nation's destiny. Students from across Africa attended her lectures, seeing in her example proof that African scientists could compete globally and drive their country's development. The social transformation extended far beyond physical infrastructure. Burkina Faso's literacy rate had increased from 40% to over 70% as oil-funded education programs reached previously isolated communities. Children who might have spent their lives farming in subsistence conditions now learned mathematics, science, and foreign languages in well-equipped schools with qualified teachers and modern technology. Fatimata represented this educational revolution perfectly. Now 15 and fluent in 5 languages, she had been accepted to universities in France, the United States, and Canada, but chose to remain in Burkina Faso to study at the new National University of Science and Technology. Her decision reflected a broader trend of young Burkinabe choosing to contribute to their country's development rather than seeking opportunities abroad. The economic ripple effects reached every sector of society. Local entrepreneurs, supported by oil revenue-funded microfinance programs, launched businesses that served both domestic markets and regional export opportunities. Women's cooperatives producing traditional textiles found new international customers, attracted by Burkina Faso's growing global profile. Healthcare achievements were equally remarkable. The country that once had one of the world's highest infant mortality rates now provided free medical care to all citizens through a network of modern hospitals and clinics. Life expectancy had increased by 5 years in just 12 months as improved nutrition, clean water access, and professional medical care addressed health challenges that had persisted for generations. Environmental protection became a cornerstone of the oil development program. Sarah's protocols required petroleum companies to restore natural habitats after extraction operations ended, while revenue from oil exports funded massive reforestation projects across the Sahel region. Solar and wind power installations, financed by petroleum profits, began reducing the country's dependence on fossil fuels, even as oil production increased. The success attracted global attention to Burkina Faso's governance model. President Traoré's administration had maintained remarkable transparency throughout the oil development process, publishing detailed financial reports and allowing international monitors to oversee revenue distribution. This approach contrasted sharply with corruption scandals that had plagued resource extraction in other African nations. International partnerships evolved beyond simple business relationships into comprehensive development collaborations. Norway shared expertise in managing petroleum wealth sustainably, while Brazil provided technical assistance in agricultural modernization funded by oil revenues. These partnerships emphasized knowledge transfer rather than dependence, building Burkina Faso's capacity to manage its resources independently. However, rapid development also created unexpected challenges. Urban migration increased dramatically, as people from rural areas sought opportunities in expanding cities. Ouagadougou's population doubled within 18 months, straining housing, transportation, and social services despite massive infrastructure investments. The government responded by implementing balanced regional development programs that created economic opportunities in smaller towns and rural areas. Oil-funded agricultural modernization projects helped farming communities increase productivity while maintaining their connection to traditional lands and lifestyles. Cultural preservation became an important priority as globalization accelerated. The National Cultural Heritage Foundation, established with oil revenues, documented traditional music, languages, and crafts while supporting artists and performers who maintained Burkina Faso's cultural identity amid rapid modernization. Religious. Communities played essential roles in helping society navigate these transformations. Imam Abdullah Sawadogo from Kanchari village now addressed international conferences on faith-based approaches to sustainable development, sharing lessons from his community's experience with sudden wealth and social change. The discovery's impact extended throughout West Africa as regional integration accelerated. Burkina Faso's new economic strength enabled it to fund infrastructure projects that connected landlocked neighbors to global markets through improved roads, railways, and telecommunications networks. Petroleum revenues also supported ambitious, renewable energy projects that positioned Burkina Faso as a leader in Africa's green energy transition. Massive solar farms in the Sahel region generated electricity for domestic use and export to neighboring countries, creating additional revenue streams while addressing climate change concerns. The country's transformation from aid recipient to development leader inspired similar approaches across Africa. Ghana, Senegal, and other nations began adopting Burkina Faso's transparency and community-focused resource management models for their own mineral and petroleum sectors. International development organizations reassessed their approaches to African engagement based on Burkina Faso's example. The country's success demonstrated that African nations could manage complex economic development independently when provided with technical support rather than paternalistic oversight. Sarah's personal story became symbolic of African women's potential in science and leadership. She received honorary doctorates from universities worldwide while using her platform to advocate for girls' education and women's participation in technical fields across the continent. The petroleum industry itself began adopting practices pioneered in Burkina Faso's oil fields. Environmental protection standards, community engagement protocols, and local employment requirements that had been developed for the discovery became international best practices for responsible resource extraction. Security challenges that had threatened the country's northern regions diminished significantly as oil-funded development programs created economic alternatives to extremist recruitment. Former militants participated in vocational training programs that enabled them to contribute constructively to their community's development. By September 2025, Burkina Faso was producing over 500,000 barrels of oil daily, generating revenues that exceeded the country's entire pre-discovery economy every month. These funds supported not only domestic development, but also humanitarian assistance to neighbors facing drought, conflict, and economic challenges. The transformation extended to diplomatic relations as Burkina Faso emerged as a significant voice in African and international affairs. President Traoré used his country's new influence to advocate for debt relief, trade reform, and climate action that would benefit developing nations globally. Village elder Amadou Ouedraogo, now recognized as a symbol of wise traditional leadership during times of change, often reflected on how completely his community's prospects had been transformed. The man who had initially warned Sarah's team about previous disappointments now served as an advisor to international delegations seeking to understand successful community-based development approaches. January 2025 brought a whirlwind of activity as Burkina Faso began the complex process of transforming from oil discoverer to oil producer. President Traoré established the Burkina Faso Sovereign Wealth Foundation, modeled after Norway's successful Petroleum Fund, to ensure that oil revenues would benefit future generations rather than creating short-term economic bubbles that often plagued resource-rich developing nations. The international bidding process for oil extraction rights attracted over 200 companies from 40 countries, creating an unprecedented economic competition. Rather than awarding contracts based solely on financial offers, the government developed comprehensive evaluation criteria that included environmental protection commitments, local employment requirements, technology transfer agreements, and community development programs. Sarah's life changed dramatically as she became the face of African scientific achievement. Universities around the world offered her prestigious positions, but she chose to remain in Burkina Faso to help manage the responsible development of the resources she had discovered. The University of Ouagadougou established a new petroleum engineering institute with Sarah as its founding director, funded by preliminary oil revenues. The first commercial oil well began operation in March 2025, producing 50,000 barrels per day of high-quality crude oil that exceeded international market expectations. The ceremony marking the first oil export was attended by presidents from across West Africa, symbolizing the region's pride in Burkina Faso's achievement and hopes for economic transformation. However, the rapid changes also created unexpected challenges. Inflation began affecting basic goods as international attention drove up costs for housing, food, and services in major cities. President Traoré implemented price controls and subsidies to protect ordinary citizens from economic disruption, while oil infrastructure was still developing. Fatimata, now 14 and fluent in English through online courses funded by Sarah's educational initiatives, started a blog documenting how oil discovery was changing life in her village. Her writing, translated into multiple languages, provided the world with an intimate perspective on African development from someone who had witnessed the transformation from the very beginning. The construction of oil processing facilities required massive infrastructure development. Roads that had been dirt paths for decades were paved with asphalt. Electrical grids extended into remote villages that had never experienced reliable power. Internet connectivity reached communities that had been isolated from global communication networks. International petroleum companies that won extraction contracts were required to hire 70% of their workforce locally, creating thousands of jobs. For young Burkinabe who had previously seen no alternative to subsistence farming or migration, technical training programs, supported by partnerships with universities in Norway, Canada, and Brazil, produced skilled workers in welding, equipment operation, and petroleum engineering. The social impact extended far beyond employment. Oil revenues funded the construction of hundreds of schools, allowing children in remote villages to receive education that had been impossible under previous economic constraints. Sarah personally oversaw programs that brought computers, laboratory equipment, and qualified teachers to rural schools throughout the country. Healthcare improvements were equally dramatic. New hospitals equipped with modern medical technology opened in regional centers, while mobile health clinics extended basic medical services to isolated communities. Maternal mortality rates, which had been among the world's highest, began declining rapidly as pregnant women gained access to trained medical professionals and emergency transportation. However, these rapid changes created tensions within traditional communities. Some village elders worried that young people were abandoning cultural values in pursuit of modern opportunities. Generational conflicts emerged as oil-funded education exposed youth to ideas and possibilities that challenged established social hierarchies. Environmental monitoring revealed both positive and negative impacts from oil extraction. While industrial development improved living standards, it also increased carbon emissions and required careful management to prevent water contamination. Sarah's environmental protection protocols became a model for sustainable resource extraction that other developing nations began studying and adopting. The discovery attracted global attention to Burkina Faso's potential in other sectors. International investors began exploring opportunities in agriculture, mining, and manufacturing. Recognizing that oil revenues could finance broader economic diversification, the government launched initiatives to develop tourism, technology, and renewable energy industries to reduce long-term dependence on petroleum exports. Regional geopolitics shifted significantly as Burkina Faso's strategic importance increased. The country that had once been considered peripheral to international affairs suddenly found itself hosting diplomatic visits from major world leaders seeking energy partnerships and political alliance opportunities. President Traoré used this new influence to advocate for African unity and development. He proposed creating a West African Petroleum Cooperation Agreement that would help neighboring countries develop their own energy resources while maintaining regional stability and cooperation rather than competition. The success story inspired other African nations to invest more heavily in geological exploration and scientific education. Countries like Chad, Central African Republic, and Mali increased funding for their own mineral and petroleum survey programs, hoping to discover similar resources beneath their territories. Sarah's example became particularly powerful for young African women interested in science and technology careers. She established scholarship programs that enabled girls from rural villages to attend university and pursue engineering degrees, creating a new generation of female scientists who could contribute to their country's development. The transformation of Kanchari village from isolated rural community to modern town with paved streets, reliable electricity, and internet connectivity became a symbol of how resource wealth could improve lives when managed responsibly. Village elder Amadou Ouedraogo, who had initially been skeptical of foreign involvement, became a vocal advocate for community-controlled development. International media coverage shifted from initial amazement about the discovery to analysis of Burkina Faso's approach to resource management. The country's emphasis on transparency, environmental protection, and community benefit began attracting positive attention from development economists and governance experts. Financial institutions worldwide reassessed their evaluation of West African investment opportunities. Burkina Faso's credit rating improved from one of the world's lowest to investment grade within 12 months, enabling the government to access international capital markets for infrastructure development projects. The oil discovery also triggered increased interest in Burkina Faso's cultural heritage. International tourists began visiting the country to experience traditional music, art, and festivals, creating additional economic opportunities for communities that had previously survived through subsistence agriculture alone. Religious organizations played crucial roles in helping communities adapt to rapid change while maintaining spiritual and cultural foundations. Interfaith councils brought together Muslim, Christian, and traditional religious leaders to develop ethical frameworks for using oil wealth responsibly and maintaining social harmony during the transition period. By mid-2025, daily oil production had increased to 200,000 barrels per day, generating over $1 billion in monthly revenue for the government. These funds supported ambitious development programs while building financial reserves that would sustain prosperity, even after oil resources were eventually depleted decades in the future.